This is a great room full of people. Good afternoon. My name's Kirsty Leivers. I'm responsible for culture, inclusion and diversity at AXA across the globe. And I'm delighted to be here with you today. I was here last year at the very first event, and then I was in the panel. I'm back moderating the panel. I'm not sure if it's a promotion. We'll see what happens to me next year. Maybe the peak of VIP is to join by video link. I'm not sure. We'll see where I am. Anyway, always delighted to have the chance to come to Milan, to see a room full of people. I assume, and I have to warn you, that this panel starts from the assumption that we believe that societal resilience is supported by gender equality. If you don't believe that, possibly you came to the wrong event. But please stay, because you are definitely the people that we need. For those of you that are in the right place, thank you, because today we have a real treat. We get to hear some research from the researchers. You've heard them already. I'm going to call them onto the stage in a moment, that talk to us about why, after all this time, after this constat and the things that we know that need to be done to support societal resilience, the shocks that we've been through, the way that gender equality supports us through those shocks, is that we're still struggling a little bit. It feels like, and I know it feels like it especially to the men when we only talk about the women's side, that we've been talking about this for a long time. So why are there still barriers? What are the barriers doing to us, and how can we start to break them down? I wanted to make two reflections on the opening statements that were wonderful. Francesco very deliberately said, it's also about men being fully involved and contributing. And beyond that, Francesco made the point that he realized he wasn't home for dinner, and he was missing out on part of life. Gender equality doesn't just work for women, clearly, it works for everybody, and that's what we want. That's what we're working for. So I stop, otherwise I'll not be invited back next time. And I invite up onto the stage with great pleasure, of course, Professor Profeta. Thank you, Paola. Wow, this clapping's going to take us a while. And boring. Okay, merci. Thank you. The director of AXA-Sciences Po. Woo! You've got a shout out there, Anne. That's brilliant. I've got Monika Queisser, the head of policy organisation at the OECD. Thank you. And last but not least, representing Italy, Simone Innocenti from AXA Italy. Fantastic. You got trapped on the way, though. Great. Okay. So what's going to be a challenge for me is keeping to time. So I'm going to do two rude things. Occasionally I will check my watch, not because I'm bored, but because we have to finish on time. I also know that the people on the stage with me have a lot to share. We did a lot of prep, and they have a whole host of information. So if I start to scowl at them, it means that I need them to move quickly through the points that they want to make. Not too quickly, but that we need to make sure we keep to time. Are we okay? Is that all right? Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. So we're going to start in the workplace, because we have a representative of the workplace here. We know that an equal contribution to society means having an equal role in the workplace. We will go then into education and home. We're going to start into the workplace. And to think about, with some of the research, Paola, I have to get used to where you are, sorry. Some of the research that you've done, Paola, about the fact that, believe it or not, for those of in this room it might be a challenge to believe, women are still, to some extent, penalised in the workplace. I think you're losing my voice now and again. Sorry. Women are still penalised in the workplace. What have you discovered in your research about that fact?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really the most important part of the story. So women are still discriminated in the labour market, and still...
Can somebody help me with mics? Because I...
Does it work?
That's better. Maybe lean that way a little bit.
Okay. So we start from the labor market because this is really the very important part of the story. So women are still penalized on the labor market, and this is true everywhere. But some countries perform a little bit better than others, for example. And at the AXA Research Lab on Gender Equality, we study this phenomenon really deeply. And so we know from data and from statistics that basically this is a problem everywhere. So no country in the world has achieved gender equality. And the economic dimension, which is labor market participation, career, gender pay gaps, etc., is the most important part. So it's one of the fundamental parts of gender gaps. So we have analyzed this under several angles, and in particular trying to understand what are the obstacles for women in the labor market. We know, for example, in Italy, female participation to the labor markets is more or less 50%, so only 1 out of 2 women work in this country. And then you have the problem of the pay gap, so differences in terms of wages, and then you have the glass ceiling, so differences in terms of careers. So what matters is that there are, of course, several obstacles. So we may talk about several issues and several dimensions, but what is very important is also that the context matters. So this is where we as organizations and as policymakers and in general each of us in our role can make a very important, play a very important role. And this is because we know that if the context, which means the political environment, but also means the policies, the measures, but also the measures that are provided or are promoted by companies and by firms go in a certain direction, this immediately translates into a better world and better possibilities for women to work and more gender equality. So there are a couple of, let's say, lessons from our research that I would like to share now, very, very quickly. So one is to this respect, let's say, in this line of research. One is a recent paper researched by Caroline Colley, who is one of our postdocs at the Gender Lab. She has analyzed the role of the Me Too movement on the labor market, and basically, everybody knows, what happened during the Me Too movement, and what she found is that the movement made it clear that women are penalized on the labor market when there is a context, when there is an environment, which is, we call it like risky environment for women, not only because they are victims of a context which is toxic behavior, toxic, male-dominated, and even sexist, but not only because of this, because they are the victims, but also because there is a double penalization, so women are somehow forced to quit their jobs in order to avoid the penalization. So this means that, the problems that we observe may have even bigger impact with respect to what we can estimate at first sight. So that's one of the contributions of the lab. Another important part of the story is that we are analyzing really deeply what it means to have a cultural context and an environment which is somehow supportive of women's career and gender equality in the workplace. So, for example, we are doing a study on stereotypes. We all talk about stereotypes, about gender bias, about the fact that men and women may have stereotypes with respect to what is the role of men and role of women in the society, at home, and in the labor market. And that says, but what we did was for the first time trying to understand the role of these stereotypes also in the workplace. So, for example, asking directly managers of big companies. So we have a very big sample, a very large sample of observations, and we're collecting new data. And what is interesting on this, which is also an ongoing recent study, what is interesting is that we are able to measure the stereotypes, and not only the explicit, like the stereotypes, like you ask what you think and people answer, but also what is known as unconscious bias, implicit stereotypes, etc. And when you measure this, the association that people do between men and career and women and family is very, very strong. So this is a fact, so we measure this, we give evidence of this, but also we look at what this means in terms of the labor market, in terms of the penalization of women in the labor market. And unfortunately, this matters a lot.
There's a strong correlation
there is a strong impact. Actually, it's a causal impact. It's more than correlation, because what we found is actually that when you remove these stereotypes, and we use like techniques that allow to really assess the impact of the policy. So when you provide information, you do this mentoring exercises, and so you remove this, try to remove this cultural biases, stereotypes, the chances that women advance in their careers and are promoted, etc., increase a lot.
That's particularly fascinating and reassuring to me as somebody looking at culture in an organisation, to know that for all of the structural things that you can do, culture very much comes down to behaviour. And we still need to take time, because when you think of sexism, of course it can be very direct and clear, but even falling into stereotypes is received and perceived as sexism, and it affects people, which I think, Anne, is something that you've done some direct studies on in terms of the relationship between sexism and likelihood to quit, if I'm right.
Yes.
You will say that better than me.
Absolutely. So we did some research in France and the US about the relationship, well, how people view sexism at the workplace. Do they see sexism as being prevalent or not? And how that correlates with intentions to quit. So the study you're referring to in particular is about the French finance industry, where we measured whether men and women working in the industry view some situations as being, situations that reflect sexism or sexual harassment. And how they think that their colleagues view those situations. And then we correlate that with whether workers are thinking about quitting their jobs. And what we find as our main result is, first of all, women want to leave the industry much more than men. You can argue, of course, that work-life balance is one of the reasons why women might want to leave the industry disproportionately compared to men. But we also find evidence that when they think that their colleagues are tolerant of sexism and sexual harassment at the workplace, that correlates really strongly with intentions to quit. So it's hard to disentangle all of the different, workplace culture is also related to work-life balance. So if you have a workplace culture that's inclusive, then generally that also means that work-life balance is better thought out, right? So it's easy to kind of just say, it's the working hours that make that women want to leave certain jobs and certain occupations and certain sectors. But it's the working hours often correlate with other types of things that are going on in the workplace. It could be, like explicit sexual harassment, but it could also be those microaggressions, jokes, you're not quite sure if they're really jokes or are they kind of an indirect way of putting in doubt your competence as a woman, for instance, right? So those different types of the way people communicate. You've also probably heard about other types of behaviors, like, being your idea being stolen, or you get interrupted in meetings more often, or you don't get invited to meetings that count, and you get invited to meetings where, that counts much less. So these types of workplace culture events matter a lot at the end of the day.
And the research, it was easy to find examples, or it was hard to find examples?
So it's my own experience as a researcher is that firms that are willing to do this type of research and that are supportive of this type of research are often firms that are really proactive in trying to create change. The thing is it's generally like the other firms, right? Where we really would like to get...
not here.
Yes. And it's generally those environments where you would like to get more data, and there it becomes much harder. Okay. So for this study in particular, we benefited from the support of the Association of Firms who were proactive in trying to create change, but it's true that not all firms participated to the same level of enthusiasm, I will say, to this research.
But with an interesting ripple effect as well, that just observing it, not even being the person at the receiving end of it, affects how people feel about staying or not, which we'll come back to a point, but for employers is important.
Yes, yeah, that's super important. So it's not only yourself having that experience, but it's talking and seeing what happens to other people, And it's also seeing how the organization reacts to these situations. So, you know, do people who experience harassment, do they feel that they would get the support of their hierarchy or not? And then you observe kind of what's going on, and that matters a lot.
Which comes back as well to the policies that are in place, which is something I'm going to come to Monika in a minute. But first it makes me think, Simone, about some very exciting work that we've done at AXA on mind health, because when Anne was talking then and I was thinking about the impact of either receiving or observing certain behaviours, the impact that it might have on people's mental well-being.
Yeah. So thank you, Kirsty. You know, we have done a research in AXA, and the report on mind health shows that women, unfortunately, mind health is less strong than men. So women are less happy than men. And there are many reasons why it's that, but I think the first, unfortunately, we're still in 2023, the first reason why women are less happy and they have a less mindful position is daily sexism, which is something that appalls me every time that I read the report, because it's unbelievable that we're still thinking and talking about sexism on a daily basis. There are some percentage that I took out from the reports. Over 40% of women have seen their abilities questioned due to gender, 2023. 1 in 3 receive unwanted comment about their gender, 2023. So, moreover, the report shows that, you know, the workplace and the way you manage a workplace have a huge effect into women and men mind health as well. So those companies who are giving and contributing by giving services on well-being and mindfulness and mindset and mental health are the ones who will be able to have an employee base which will deliver more and will flourish more. So I give you some example. I'm here representing AXA Italy. So
maybe just, if I may,
yep.
I want to make one precision, and maybe it was clear and maybe not. The study was not of AXA.
No.
The study was a huge study of...
Sure. It was commissioned, but it was huge. Yes, I agree.
Absolutely.
So it's not
it was
about
much
AXA.
broader than AXA.
Yeah, sure. So go back to some example that we have put in place in Italy during the course of the year. In AXA Italy, we started in 2009 from the very basics. So we started with a program on bias and bias conscious. We started rolling out to all the population, so to men and women. First we start with women, and when we said why only women, so we spread it out to all managers and employees of the organization, and we built during the course of the year up upon this. We have started in 2009 a service for all the employees on health, mind health. It's a 24-hour service, which is for all employees available by phone or by Teams, and it's fully confidential, of course, and there are experts who are helping each one of us in managing mental health conditions. And we didn't stop here. So we have a full checkup on a yearly basis, digital, on health, mental health and physical health, which is provided through the course of the year for all the employees. And this is another step towards having a very nice environment where population, when people can feel as well, how should I say, free to get those services on a demand basis. And we replicate training on genders constantly, awareness session on a yearly basis. We focus on different topics on a yearly basis as well. And we work heavily on one of the things that I heard either from Paola or from you about the language. So we promote an inclusive language. That means that we have no tolerance for non-inclusive language on the business side, and we erased and we changed every single HR policy, and now all the HR policy have an inclusive language in the organization. And I think this makes a difference for the employees to feel at ease. Yes. Whatever they are, whatever they represent, whoever they are, whatever they want to say, they are, free to say and to think what they want.
it starts to show your point about the behaviours that people see affecting the overall culture and the challenges that's things. The thing I remember from the study, and I won't quote it, I'll let you look it up because I might make a mistake, is that when women were not subject to sexism, their mental well-being was at a par with men. And there were just a couple of countries where, in fact, men were subject to more sexism than women, and they, in the same way, had a mental health that suffered. So you start to see a real storm of factors that can affect women's ability to be able to contribute fully in the workplace. And you started then, Simone, to touch on the policies and the things that organisations can do, and some very specifically that you've done some great work on in AXA Italy. But Monika, you're our resident expert here on the kind of policies and practices that organisations or even governments can put into place. What kind of things are you looking at now and seeing in the work that you're doing?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me congratulate Paola and AXA for this fantastic work. For us at the OECD, it's hugely useful to have a better understanding of what's going on in companies. Because we work with governments, so we analyze big policy issues, we ask our member countries what they're doing, but business for us often is still a bit of a black box because we simply don't have the same type of access. So this type of work you're doing is fantastic. So continue the good work.
We'll enjoy that moment, thank you very much.
And we're very happy to be collaborating on this. Now to your question, I think there's about 3 policy areas with respect to companies where we're seeing that our member countries are really pushing in that direction. The first one's pay transparency. We have over half of OECD countries now that have pay transparency mechanisms in place. Some are quite mild. They're just kind of gender reporting on very few indicators, but then there's gender audits, there's compulsory reporting, there's even reporting with penalties. If you take a country like France, for example, where of course, which AXA knows very well, there it really bites because there's financial penalties now for companies that are not getting up to speed if they're not performing on the index. So you have the whole range of things, and what we're doing at the OECD to help our member countries, which eventually should be helping companies as well, is to create a toolkit how countries can start having good pay transparency policies in place, which build on the still relatively young evidence that we have from some countries. So that's one area. Second area, I think, and which is a cutting edge area as well, is the whole flexible work issue. This is something where we know that families need it, families want it, and COVID has been a game changer in this respect. So we've been doing some analysis on who takes up flexible work, but to be honest, we're also quite concerned that flexible work shouldn't, and telework in particular, should not become the new part-time work. Because we all know when women work part-time, 50%, you're about considered 70% not there and 30% there. Everybody thinks that women who work part-time, they can't really count on them. Oh, she's never there, and so on. We know that. And if the same thing happens with teleworking, where now we have hybrid meetings, right? And the people, I don't know how you experience it, but I find that half of the time when you have a hybrid meeting, there's all these people on the screen somewhere, and then there's this vibrant conversation going on in the room, and the people on the screen are trying to lift their hands and kind of say, can I say something, please? And that would be the typical thing that could happen to women. So I think we all, and particular managers and HR departments, have to be very, very vigilant to make sure that this happens. And I'm not sure, I haven't figured out for myself yet, and it'd be interesting to hear from you what the role of governments is here. Whether we need governments in this, or should this be a company decision? How much do you need help from your governments to regulate this, or not? So you might be saying, get out of my way, I just want to do it as a company. So I think that's an interesting conversation to be had. And the third area, which is really also cutting edge, is parental leave. And we heard it from the CEO very prominently, how important that is, and to take leave and to be available and not to miss your children's lives. And the good news is that the millennials, they really want this. They ask for it. And we see also with the kind of pioneer country Iceland, which was the first one to really have a non-transferable father's leave. If you look at the charts starting in the early 2000s and going up to now, the number of people, of men taking leave, every time there was a policy change, you don't even need to do sophisticated analysis. You just look at the chart and you see how it works. But then I think we also have to work on women in that respect, because the real change would be that you make the leave completely shareable or 50-50. And even in the most progressive countries, women don't really want that, because they still kind of think, well, 6 months for a woman, 6 months for a man to start with, but then the other 6 months, they shouldn't really be 3 months, they should be 6 months for the mothers. So I think we women also have to start thinking about how we maybe go a little bit hands off and also accept
and share with the men.
A real sharing here, for at least for those who want to. And I think again there's a role for companies to be encouraging that. So let me stop here. Plenty more to say,
wow.
But
yeah. Well, a great start, and I felt like Anne maybe wants to react on the government thing, so I might just check in with her. But I just wanted to recap because that was so strong. Transparency, and I think we found that in so many of our processes, all of them. Promotions, recruitment. We need to talk very transparently about why people are being chosen and for what reasons, because if not, people make up their own story. But then what I heard in your second 2 points is, I think we need to make sure that everybody takes advantage of everything that's on offer. It's not just about women. Let's make sure that we hybrid work, so in the office, not in the office, in similar ways, and make patterns, and that's when I'm going to pass to Anne in a second. And also when it comes to leave, parental leave, I deeply agree with you, and I think we'll come back to that point, that we need everybody, so ladies and gentlemen, to participate in that moment and take the full aspect of life and not just be talking about what's happening in the workspace. Did you have a reaction on the government piece, Anna? Were you just enjoying what Monika was telling us?
No, I was agreeing. So it actually reflects part of research that we did at the Women in Business Chair, looking at, for instance, what happens when you have quota policies that are like hard quotas, like France, Norway, where you actually have sanctions if the quotas are not implemented, versus countries where firms are free to implement quotas. And that basically, when they're free to implement quotas, not much changes. But if you have like strong policies that change, the cost for firms of not implementing gender equality, that's where you create change. So that's why I was kind of agreeing on the fact that if you leave it up to the firms, it might be very slow.
And that moves me beautifully, because I wanted to ask Paola exactly about quota, but if I may, before we start, because I have a feeling it gets a bit warm on the topic. The only thing you're not allowed to say is that I don't believe in quotas, but I like what they do. You can't say that for me. No sitting on the fence here. Do we do quotas or not? Paola, what does your research say?
Yes, that's a very controversial issue.
I know.
Okay, yes. Okay, and also the students know. Okay, so that's a very controversial issue. So in the ideal world, we don't need quotas, okay? I mean, that's for sure. I mean, if we live in an ideal world where...
we won't be here, huh? It's okay.
But the world is very different from that. And in the real world, the quotas, when quotas have been introduced, they have been successful. In a sense that we have analyzed several examples of quotas in business, so on corporate boards, and quotas in politics. So these are like two parallel areas that of research that we conduct at the lab, and I will summarize a little bit what we have found. So for quotas on boards, so boards of companies, you know that in Italy the law that introduced the board gender quotas dates back 2011, so many years ago. It was one of the first countries in Europe after Norway, together with France, and then many others followed. And now we know that there is also a European directive, so it's at the European level. So when we have analyzed this data and we have analyzed what happened, what we have found particularly strong was, first of all, that the quotas have imposed a better selection, because the initial one, the status quo, was not particularly efficient in terms of the selection of people. So men are also better selected when there is the quota, not only women, just because it's like opening the floor. That's and opening to everybody. No?
So actually we pick better people because of that pressure.
Better people, because we get rid of the worst men somehow, and so I mean it was like 95% of men. So basically it's just opening the competition. You have a bigger pool, and that's the main story. So it's an issue of selection. Of course, it depends on the status quo, because as I said at the beginning, women were only 5% in these board positions in Italy. So there's a strong effect. And then there is another effect. Okay, the effect on performance was not particularly strong, at least with our data. Thus has to be particularly clear here. Quotas are also good for us as economists, as researchers, because they represent an exogenous shock that increases the share of women in leadership positions. Then we can see what happens once they are there. And this is not very often the case, because many times you have just a correlation. You don't know, because you don't know whether women have been appointed because the firm performs better, or it's these women that lead the firms to perform better. It's very difficult to disentangle this. With the quotas you can. So the effect on performance is not particularly strong, but not negative also. I mean, it's fine. And we have a very strong effect on the stock market. I mean, those are listed companies. When we have introduced the quotas, the stock market reactions was very positive. So the returns of this company increased, because also the quality of the women was good. So of the selection effect that I mentioned before. So that's particularly interesting. And then we are conducting also parallel research, as I said, women's empowerment and the role of quotas also in terms of in the real world politics. And here we have very interesting ongoing research with another postdoc researcher at the lab, who is Giulia Savio, who's also somewhere here. Before I mentioned the work by Caroline. So with Giulia, what we are doing is we are understanding what women do when they are policymakers. Okay, so when they are leadership position, because they are policymakers, for example, in municipalities or at the government level, etc. So here also we have a clear identification, what we call identification strategy, but let's say a way to understand that the gender of the politician is somehow exogenous with respect to the policy that they implement. And we find that there is a difference. So the outcome is different, like the agenda is different. So for example, women care more about childcare, health, education, spending, etc., with respect to men. And these are things that in turn may be good for gender equality. So they are different. We also found that, for example, in times of crisis, so when there is the pandemic, and this is a more recent study, again together with Giulia and the researchers at the lab. So when there is the pandemic, so there is a period of crisis, these differences are somehow reduced. So it's kind of there is a kind of alignment of what you decide, because there is a kind of an emergency external. So that's also interesting. So it's different what you decide during an emergency and what you decide in normal times. Okay?
And I might come back to that point on what COVID did in a second. But
okay.
Just if I summarize on quotas, I think I can quote you as saying quotas are good.
Yeah, I mean, especially in places where basically you don't have equality.
No, I think what I heard, and it's quite clear, that quotas have a strong effect. They speed up the change.
Yeah.
They raise the bar generally.
Yes.
They're good for the share price, which is good news for business.
Yes, it's good.
And they give a broader picture that supports societal resilience,
yeah.
because they have a broader image of what might be important. Okay. So why, Simone, don't you have quotas at AXA Italy?
Exactly, we don't have. But the reason why I think we don't have it, because we put in our strategy the growth of women. So women growth is at the center of our strategy, used to be, it is, and it will be in the future. Instead of using quota, which I believe they're very useful in some instances, and I don't want to be in the middle of a debate where, you know,
that would have been fun.
That would be interesting, but it's not the moment to debate on that. I think we substitute in a way quotas with strong KPIs, with a tight control of KPIs and strong policy on D&I, on equal pay, and on succession planning for women. So the idea was to strengthen and widen the leadership of women by using strong KPI mixed with culture ignition. So on top of the KPI that we have, I give you an example. On equal pay gap, we can talk about it for hours, but one simple example is our candidates, and the short list of candidates need to be 50-50. So there is no way you can go out of this policy the last 2 candidates or the last 4 candidates needs to be 50-50. There's no way you can do it differently. Then we choose the best, but at least we give the same opportunity to men and women to be there sitting in front of the decision maker, which was already trained before on biased, inconscient bias, the value of having diversity within the company. So this is what we do to implement our mechanism of control of our KPIs. Again, not quotas, but KPIs. Culture, so huge investment on mentoring, huge investment as well with association like Valore D in Italy, which is a huge association for women growth. 75 people have been trained and have been part of a development program with Valore D since 2014. We have this very strong and tight partnership with them. We were very proud, and we're still very proud to be maybe the first one, or at least one of the first to introduce parental policy. And for us, the major reason to introduce parental policy is exactly what we were saying. Balance between men and women co-share one of the best moments in life, which is the birth of a son or a daughter, and to get out from the stigma of having the mother in charge. Because these will create inequality for women, because women are equal to mother, equal to need to care about kids. Men as well. I mean, let them, and I agree, you were saying millennials want it. There are several colleagues here in the rooms who have taken, male colleagues who have taken parental leaves here, and the numbers are increasing with the time. So this is extremely good for me. And again, I am super proud to be here today because I think we are really representing a company and an organization where people are able to live their life in working life, but as well their home life in an organization that really value individuals as different people. Each one of us is different. Each one of us have something different to say. Each one of us will contribute in a different way, but to one thing, the success of our organization, and moreover, the success of our country and society.
And I think, if I can forgive you, because I think I heard Giacomo tell us at the beginning that you have gender balance at the top. So even without your,
you're right. So you're right. One of the things as well that made us choose not to have quota is because we are starting from a very good point. So 47% of our base employee is women. 51% of millennials are women, and we have 42% of executive in our management committee, female executive in our management committee. So this is one of the things. Thank you for reminding me this because it's important.
I could feel Giacomo.
Yeah, it was just like.
But I think what was interesting though, and then that's an interesting live example to hear, is that when you're already in a good place, and you're trying to maintain and sustain, which by the way is not easy as well, I think we can agree, then that's a different approach, because I loved your idea of a shock, the idea of creating that movement and making that happen. I think that, and then, and Monika, you talked about policies and parental leave, and I come back to you to see if there's any extra advice you want to offer around that or observations you've had. But I think first maybe to you, Anne, because the big organizations like ours now are really focused on the war on talent and the fact that the working population, it's harder to recruit people, it's harder to keep them. And I think you've shown, if I understand well, that policies really matter. So when we think about the things that Monika's told us from the OECD, that's really what keeps people and attracts them. Am I right? Is that something you've looked at?
Yes, so indeed, policies matter a lot. I think for a long period of time, there was kind of this idea, at least in France, for instance, where I grew up, that kind of, gender equality is just going to happen on its own. And it's going to be maybe a little bit slow, but then it's going to happen on its own. But then when you look at the numbers in terms of how things have changed, so the percentage of women in management positions, the percentage of women in STEM fields in terms of their study trajectories, the gender pay gap throughout European countries, there's some variation, but basically over the past 20 years, it's pretty much constant. Not much has changed. I think there was a period of time where, in the 2010s, where we were kind of saying, women need to lean in more, women need to be more self-confident, take more risks, speak up more, like kind of, those were the barriers. And then if we do nudges and, like, maybe that works a little bit, role models, yes, that works, but, it's in the little bit, at the end of the day, it's still just, it's small changes. And now we're really seeing, 10 years later, not much has changed. And what really does create change are strong public policies that change the way people really make decisions. So we're back kind of to the cost-benefit structures of firms. Firms often are governed by inertia on these topics. And if there's a shock, then indeed, maybe they are going to revise their policies. And it can come, I think, like this cost-benefit analysis that firms make depend on two factors. First, the law. So in countries like France, where there are clear costs for firms not to implement gender diversity, that creates change. But also financial markets. And the financial crisis of 2008 was a game changer to some extent, also because you had consulting firms like Deloitte, McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, etc., that published reports showing that, if we continue like that, change is not going to happen for another 130 years. The EU Commissioner Nelly Kroes in, I think it was 2011, made the Lehman Sisters argument, kind of saying if more women were in leadership positions, we would not have the financial crisis. So that's, you could
shocks again.
Yeah, you could say, is this true or not, but the argument is there. And the argument has led financial markets to look more carefully at what firms are doing concretely to make their workforce more inclusive, broadly speaking. And so I think like those two mechanisms, so both strong public policies, but also financial markets, they matter a lot.
Yeah, and people care. People care now about the organisation they work for and the kind of policies that they have in place. I just want to come back to you, Monika, briefly on policy and maybe particularly from my side on parent policy, but you might have other topics you want to touch, because then we're going to come out of the workplace for a little while. So on the things that you've heard from the room on parental policy, can you see that there's an impact of this change? Like Anne was saying, it's been slow for a long time, and I love this idea of the shock of quota. What is the shock in policy terms that can really make a change?
Well, as I said, the non-transferable parental leave is quite a shock, because it really touches the culture and this idea that it's the woman who has to take care of a baby. And obviously there's also objective reasons for that. For those women who want to breastfeed, it's much easier to be on a longer leave than combine that with work. We all know how complicated that can be. And not all employers are providing the infrastructure for that. So there's also, I don't want to say that there's no reasons why women would like to have that. But I think there's a couple of other factors. It's not enough to just say, here's leave, take it. It has to be well remunerated. Because if you don't, you can have leave schedules, and there are some countries that have the possibility, men don't even know about it, because nobody would ever take it, because it's not well paid enough. And so since we know women make less than men, it's the woman then where it makes economic sense within a household for the woman to take the leave and not the man. So that's one point, it has to be well remunerated. Another point is it has to be followed up by a whole infrastructure, because leave is just around the childbirth and the first years of a child. Afterwards, you need affordable, high-quality childcare, because we know, particularly in countries like my own, I'm from Germany, there's a lot of reticence to put children into childcare. Culturally, the Germans are having a really hard time with, still it's getting better, but there is still this element of a child is best taken care of by a mother, and you will not be able to convince them if the childcare is not good quality or if it's unaffordably expensive. So that's another important point that we really need. And then finally, the third point I'd say is it needs to be followed up by a culture within the workplace. The two OECD countries that have the most leave, nobody believes this if you say it, are Japan and Korea. Okay, that's where there's the most father's leave, and nobody takes it.
I was going to say, okay.
No, because it's too scary. Because the sanctions in the company are just too big. And I talked to some Japanese colleagues and people who tried it, and they said never again, because they're ostracized when they return to work, because it harms their career, because they're made fun of by other men, and so on. So actually, just in the news 2 days ago, there was an news item on Japan, where Japan now wants to make it mandatory for men to take more parental leave. And they have a goal of 85% of all fathers taking, I don't know how many days of leave in a couple of years. But again, here we're really with strong quota-like regulation, and I think we're still talking about something which is fundamentally very private.
Yes.
And I think we shouldn't be forgetting that either. So if we cannot force people into a situation like that, I'm not sure how good caretakers they will be if they really don't want to be there either,
If they're stressed about not being at work, if they're worried about
exactly,
that.
or so I think it has to be an organic change also with all of society, and I do think that there's a lot to be said for awareness campaigns. I mean, you like the influencers or you don't, but the fact of the matter is influencers have a lot of influence and can move social norms. So I think we do have to work more on that. And Paola, you had this great example of Me Too, which is a negative norm where suddenly, from one day to the next almost, things that were kind of acceptable before suddenly weren't at all anymore. And so I'm quite optimistic in that sense that there are some actions that can really change culture. And we need something disruptive like that on the leave front as well. Not quite sure yet what that can be, but I think we have to explore all channels to make this possible. And can I make a final point on fertility, because the minister mentioned that. And this is something where a lot of OECD countries are obviously very worried about, because I mean, a country like Korea, every year there's a new record of decline in fertility. They're at 0.7, I think, children per woman. So they're very, very worried, and they're trying all kinds of things. And we were just recently asked by Norway to undertake a family policy review, because up until now, we always said if you have a good leave system, a good childcare system, and good infrastructure, a good tax system that taxes household incomes in a fair way, that doesn't discriminate against women, then people are going to have babies. Well, it turns out that even in the Scandinavian countries now, there are strong declines of fertility. So we're going to have to observe this very closely now, and our story has to be revised because it doesn't hold anymore now. And there's lots of young people here in this room, which I think is fantastic, and I think we need conversations with you also about your preferences, if you want to have children, if you maybe don't want to have children, and maybe also that's why we have to, it's a personal decision, and the world is full of people, as we know, and there's many people who are migrating, and so there's also a question around, does every country have to try hard to increase their fertility rate? But one thing is clear, that's another argument to bring more women into the labor force. And as you said, Paola, there's plenty of space to do that in Italy, for example.
They are fascinating examples, and fascinating examples of how things are changing in ways that we haven't even understood yet or know how to react to. And maybe I just want to come back to one point, which was, it's hard to be, you gave the examples of Japan and Korea, but it's hard to be in any culture the first man to do those things, to take those leaves, to be present and not pretending even that you're still doing it. So, bravery required, and we need those pioneers to go out and do it. Another point that was made earlier that I wanted to jump back to was the fact that big shifts, and you made the point about quota being a push. COVID, in some ways, and I think you're going to tell me something different, Paola, but I'd thought was a great gift in terms of moving towards a more flexible workplace, so more flexible working hours, more acceptance of working remotely, in spite of the risks that we already talked about. So I thought that for me that was one of those shifts that had revolutionized the workplace. But I think, because now I want to step outside of the workplace, some of your research has shown that COVID has not been so good for women's place. Is that right?
No, actually, we have done a lot of research on COVID, yes, we at the different levels. Okay, so first of all, we have seen what happened during the COVID within the family. Okay, so in terms of gender roles, etc. And so what we have seen, we have again many data of a representative sample of the population that was in Italy, and so what we have observed is that especially during the first waves, I mean first and second, so the first part of the pandemic and the lockdown, this has certainly increased responsibility for in terms of domestic work, housework, childcare for the families. And the initial expectation was, okay, so probably this is going to be shared equally among men and women because everybody's at home, because there is flexibility, working at distance, etc. And that was not exactly the case because gender norms are more persistent. So basically, men also increased a little bit the amount of time they spent in childcare and housework, but women much more. So the gap is still there, okay? So it's the COVID did not equalize, so let's say yes.
Yeah.
But
maybe such I come back, but maybe, and I think you showed something different, right?
Yes, so we did an analysis on France during the first lockdown, really the first lockdown, so 2 months after, it was early May, so 2 months after the beginning of the COVID crisis. So kind of up until that point, up until COVID and its lockdown policies, most countries, if not all, have gone from, very unequal policies to making policies that are in favor of gender equality gradually. One of them being an important one is access to early childhood education and having access, to really policies that enable women, even with young children, to go to work. And in France, that is the case, or that was the case. And then when COVID hits, everything closed down. And what we found was that fathers of children who were 12 or under, so those that kind of did require childcare or, during the lockdown crisis while they were at home, those fathers reverted to some extent to believing in more traditional gender norms. So saying more often that they agreed with statements like a man's job is to earn money, a woman's job is to take care of the home and family, compared to before COVID. And kind of what our research suggests is that if you make it costless for individuals to believe in gender equality, then yes, people will say, I'm in favor of gender equality. But once you increase the cost, so for instance, by forcing couples to make decisions like who's going to take care of the kids now, then you go back to more unequal gender norms. And so you see how these beliefs, it's not like once you learn gender equality, you are gender equal for life. That's not the way it goes. Gender equality and beliefs in gender equality really depend on the institutional structure that is there to help support it. So then we go back to this idea that public policies really matter a lot.
Yeah, and also when we see it, and it's the only place we very easily lose the ground that we've made, and across the world we see that, I think, in different places. There's one more thing, and we're moving into the last 10 minutes, okay, so now we have to, but there was something as well, because one of the things, there's many things obviously that are difficult about a job when you're talking about culture and inclusion, but he's trying to avoid stereotypes. And one of the things we look at is children's education, and I really, it was Paola. I'm getting my people mixed up. It was Paola. Second time I've done that. Paola, it was. You can. You will. Paola, I'm sorry. It was your research onto education and why less girls are going into STEM. Yes, and I don't want to believe this is true. I have to tell you, Paola. I'm letting you tell everybody, but I don't like it.
Yes, unfortunately, it is true. And actually, we spend. We devote a lot of time of our research, a lot of effort at the AXA Gender Lab. On gender equality, on education, and there's scarcity of women in STEM discipline, okay? So we know that women are more educated than men now, almost in all countries, at least in Europe, but I think more or less in the OECD, and even in Italy and everywhere, but they are very few in STEM disciplines. So there are several things, of course. It's very difficult. There is not just unique, let's say, obstacle. So there are many things. And what we have analyzed, and this is research done by a third researcher of our lab, and she is Silvia Griselda. She has analyzed a lot, for example, the way, the tests, the way people are tested in math and in STEM disciplines, okay? So, for example, a recent study that she has conducted has found that multiple choice exams, which are widely used, especially in mathematics, tend to favor boys over girls. And yes, so if there is an initial math gender gap, this may increase even more. So for example, she found that an increase in the share of multiple choice questions by 10% increased the gender math scores by 50% in favor of boys. We have found, and that's an important result, there is also, so the way also we test people is important. For example, in another research, again, at the lab which I conducted, we have found that also the pressure of this type of exams, that typically it's like time pressure, it's really that you have to hurry up, you have to answer a lot of questions in very short time. We have done a lot of experiments related to this. This is not necessarily good for performance, so it's not necessarily capturing the best people, those who really know things better, but it's a disadvantage for girls. So it puts putting a lot of this pressure and anxiety on girls, reduces their performance, without increasing very much like the selection process or in terms of, rewarding the more
I felt like, Monika, you felt the pain there? You don't like multiple choice and time-pressured exams?
No, multiple choice is not something I like, it's true, yeah. But we all know stories of, and I hear them more often from girls completely anecdotally, but kind of having anxiety attacks, just going blank when you're in front of your piece of paper because it's so scary, this math. And
so a new OECD policy, no more multiple choice tests?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that, but what our PISA results show, it's even when girls are good at math, they're convinced that they're not as good as the boys.
Because of the
so there's this auto-censoring that goes on for girls as well.
Simone, you like multiple choice? I don't. I love a multiple guess. I think they're great. Odds are with us. I would love to go down that route because I think that education in the future is going to change a lot. The whole style of the way they're educated, but that would be another hour, and we're in the last 4 minutes. So probably, based on what we've heard about creating shocks in the system, about more transparency, about going with the whole population and seeing what nudges we can make to improve the situation for everybody, the battle isn't won yet. And I'm going to come to each of my panel for one word of reflection on what we've said, or one word of hope for the future, and I'm going to start with Monika.
Well, I remain optimistic. I think we've come a long way, and I think we've seen a couple of disruptive events recently which show that change is possible. We've also, globally, obviously, we're dealing with situations like Afghanistan, Iran, so we should not forget that we are, even in a more conservative OECD country, we're still very, very well off compared to other people in the rest of the world. But I do believe, I have huge confidence in the younger generations, that you're going to change things, and it's going to be quite a different world out there. So, yeah, optimism.
Yeah, we're going to be more resilient as time goes on.
Absolutely.
We're going to do it. Paola.
Yes, but we really need, to build the context where this may happen, okay? So we really need to invest more into policies, into research, into, organizations, because as we said many times, this is also a cultural problem. So there are stereotypes and there are these things that are very difficult to remove. So as we said already, we really need strong push if we want to change.
In policy, and I come back to Francesco at the beginning, and every single one of us, every single one has a little job, every day in making decisions that support gender equality.
I agree. Also on the awareness issue, I think we've made a lot of progress. I'll say that I think like one of the main challenges for the future is at least like for a country like France, where a lot of policies have been implemented at the firm level, is now like more into higher education and education in order indeed to get more women into STEM fields.
Do you like multiple choice questions?
Yes or no? So I'll say actually yes, because I do enjoy taking risks. So it's like counter-stereotypical, but I'll actually say yes. But then we're always thinking in terms of averages, right? When we talk about these questions. And so I think there too, like getting into, so I think this is another challenge a little bit for the future, is looking at the diversity of profiles. It's not just binary men and women. Totally. So we're thinking much more broadly of what does it mean to think in those terms. So I think we're also looking more at the workplace, at the individual level. What can we do to make it inclusive for everyone? So
absolutely, real resilience is everybody being able to give the best of their ability. Huh? Excellent, good point to finish on, Anne. And Simone?
So conscious of time,
Absolutely.
I'll say only, I agree with with everything. So I would say never give up and look at the future with a positive attitude, considering the steps that we have done in the last 10 years, at least in our organization. So never give up and looking at the future in a positive way.
Yeah, the big steps forward are happening. There's a huge amount of research quoted in that session, so please check it out. There's plenty to read, and do something different today that helps us make it a more gender equal workplace and world even. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you very much. Thank you. You're great. Super.